Hello, everyone. This is number 14 in my ongoing series on YouTube dealing with Jesus archaeology, that is, texts and material evidence and how they might work together to shed light on the historical Jesus. In the last few episodes, we've been doing final days of Jesus, the last week of Jesus, and particularly what the archaeological evidence would give us as a kind of a backdrop to reading some of the texts that seem to be our earliest and maybe most reliable, historically speaking. So we've come to the final episode in terms of going through the material, and that is the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. So I've got slides, and I'm going to get started right away. Okay, so here's the path that we've taken with these last episodes, and we've come down to the last two. Let's start with crucifixion. First and foremost, our best evidence from Jerusalem is from a tomb discovered in 1968 north of the Old City off of Nablus Road, and it contained the skeletal remains of a crucified victim. His name was Yehochanan, unknown otherwise to us in terms of who he might have been. It's a fairly common name. But in his foot bone, which would be here, through the heel, this is a model. This is what was actually discovered and saved. And here's the actual thing. These are models. And lo and behold, it turns out that a crucifixion nail, and here's an example of what one of them looked like, was put through the heel, not through the front of the foot, as many had thought for centuries. Because when we read in the Gospels about Jesus's hands and feet being nailed, it was natural for artists to picture a nail going through somehow the 2 feet together or something like that. And even this, I'm not sure, is exactly correct. And we know now that this is not correct. The nails were not in the wrists. For years in teaching courses about the historical Jesus and dealing with archaeology, I would teach the students. I knew about this and the heel bone, but I didn't know about the hands. And now we know about the hands as well. And I was of the impression, and I'd been taught in graduate school, that the nails of the arms were put through the wrists between the radius and ulna bones because that could hold the weight of the body. And it turns out, in fact, that that's not correct, as I'll show you in a minute. But why the heel bone? Because there's no blood vessels. And if you put any nail through the feet, you would have just massive bleeding. The person would pass out very quickly from blood loss. And then the whole point of crucifixion, which is to prolong the suffering of the victim over several days, would be all over in just a matter of minutes as the person bled to death. And so this has clarified that for us. This is probably the way it was done. It makes more sense, almost like writing stirrups of nails, which is really a rough idea to even think about. But as far as the hands, the arms were tied, we think now, to carry the weight, and the ropes might have been more up here. This drawing might not be exactly accurate. And then the hands were on the back like this, but they were tacked with these small nails. This is from another crucified victim. He's actually known and identified to us as Antigonus or Matthias, who was the last of the Hashmonean kings. And Mark Antony, after Herod defeated him, had him crucified as well as beheaded. And in his hand bone, this is part of his hand bone, this is his jaw. We took DNA from the jaw, but this is actually part of the hand. You see how the nails are still held into the hand right here. And so this was just to sort of tack the hand so you couldn't move back and forth and your hands would be back over the cross. And so these are nails that were put into the hand. And so we have a better idea of how somebody like Jesus would have been crucified. It's a horrible thing to even think about. Dehydration, fatigue, shock, loss of blood, and in the case of Jesus, being scourged and beaten and whipped and being up all night under a kind of a torturous situation, to say the least. It's no surprise that he would die rather quickly. Now, where did it happen? That's where some archaeology also comes in. There are three main proposals, the third of which is primarily one that I've supported, but not too many people are onto it or have heard it or even agree with it. Most of the scholars would say Jesus was crucified right here. So here's our Oxford map of the city. The red lines are going around like this. Here's the Temple Mount. We've studied all of this. And the wall at that point, we think, went down like this. And we do read in the Gospels that Jesus was crucified outside the city wall. And so if the wall ran like this would be the place, Golgotha. That's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then he would have been taken from the Antonio Fortress, the Via della Rosa, down through the city like this and into this area outside the city and crucified. So that is by far the majority view. This is the holiest site in Christendom, as we say, and different Christian bodies, Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Coptic, Armenian, and so forth, all agree that this is the place. And many Christians of a non-Catholic tradition also consider this the place, and also by far, from what I can tell, the majority of archaeologists and scholars put it right here. There's an alternative site. This is the north, just outside Damascus Gate, would be right here, and it's called Gordon's Calvary or the Garden Tomb. So this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was built in the 4th century, the early 4th century, under the reign of the Emperor Constantine. And Helena, his mother, was a devout Christian, and she traveled to the Holy Land and built a number of churches. Now, this church has been modified, even destroyed at various times and rebuilt. But inside, there are some ancient areas that go back to the time of Constantine. Here I am standing in front of it a few years ago, coming back from a dig, and I took my students inside. And this is the door that you enter when you go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There's a plaza here where people wait to get in, but it's pretty open sometimes, as you can see here. And then if you go back to the model that we've looked at before, this would be that northern wall, and there was a quarry here, and it's thought that the crucifixion was on one of the rocks of the quarry to make it sort of visible to people passing on the road. So this might have been what it would have looked like. And then there were some tombs nearby. Here's one right here. And Jesus was placed in such a tomb, according to this theory. When you go inside, right at the door, you get to this slab, which is where Jesus' body was laid, you're told, as a pilgrim. I will tell you this, not to be overly skeptical here, but this stone has been changed. I don't know how many times, but I know when I went in 1962 for the first time and saw this, and people are touching it and kissing it and so forth. This is a newer one because the old one was removed and up against a wall, and this one had just been put in. And so now it's lasted since the 60s and will last for hundreds of years more. But people come in, very devoted pilgrims. They're convinced that the body of Jesus lay on this slab of preparation. It's been placed here so that pilgrims can access it and pray and kneel down in front of it and show their devotion. Right behind it here is a staircase that you go up, and you get to a higher level, which is called Golgotha, the mount where Jesus was crucified. So you've got to go up a bit, and it's been chipped away over the years, but there's a bit of it left. And you can see some of the rock here under glass and here. And then inside here, you can put your hand down through and actually touch the rock. And so you can imagine, I came at a time when there were no crowds. Often it's just packed with people waiting. And you can only imagine the millions and millions of people that have reached down and touched that. And it's a very quiet and reverent sight with people completely silent, filing in, touching it, praying, sometimes lighting candles and so forth. So this, according to tradition, is built over the rock where Jesus was crucified, the rock of Golgotha, the place of the skull. Here, as you come back down again and past the slab, which is over here, you wait to go into the tomb. This particular structure, the edicle, is built around what's left of what is believed to be the tomb. So it's very near the place of crucifixion. So you've got the slab for laying out the body, the place of crucifixion, and the tomb. And here you can see pilgrims waiting for hours to go inside. It's one or two people at a time, and then you come back out. Now you don't go through, you go inside, and then you come back out. So it takes quite a bit of time. It was recently completely examined and fortified and strengthened because it was beginning to crack. But they did take advantage of the renovations and actually remove the slab that the pilgrims go to inside where Jesus' body is said to have been lain. And of course, examined all the things underneath, and there were no skeletal remains. So it is, for pilgrims, truly an empty tomb. Now, there are other tombs back behind here. If you see that little archway, if you go back here in the back, there's a tomb that is a first century tomb, and it's now called the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. But remember, Joseph of Arimathea, supposedly, according to Matthew, only Matthew says this, put Jesus in his own tomb. So some scholars have suggested that even though this area of the church is revered, the real tomb of Jesus might be back through here in the back. And most people don't know that. When I do tours of Israel, of course, I take people into the actual first century tomb that is in this area of the ancient quarry. So that's number one. Number two is Gordon's Calvary. It's named after the British General Gordon, who first came up with the idea, or at least popularized it. I think others had suggested it earlier. And he saw this craggy mound. He was actually eating breakfast with the Spafford family, according to the story, on the northern wall of Jerusalem. And he looked out and he caught this glimpse of this bedrock. And he made the observation, this looks a lot like a skull. Maybe the place of crucifixion would be more prominent, something like this, a hill, actually. We talk about the hill of Calvary, and maybe this is it. But is there a tomb in a garden nearby? And as it happens, there is this garden tomb very nearby. But the problem with this tomb, even though it's near that bedrock outcropping, is that the scholars and archaeologists have dated this to the Iron Age. And remember, in the Gospels, we get the idea that Jesus is put in a new unfinished tomb that would have been dug in his own time. So if it's an Iron Age tomb, it's unlikely that this is it. There is a trough here for a rolling stone, and in fact, there is a rolling stone on display. And it's really a very deeply devotional place when you visit it. It's quiet, it's serene. People are meditating, reading the gospel accounts, meeting together in little groups and praying. So it is worth visiting, and I do take my groups there just to see it. I favor this site, the Mount of Olives, east of the city. There's a lot of evidence for it. I'll talk about that at the end because I'm going to put some things in the description and show you a couple of blog posts and so forth. But this is a view of the Mount of Olives taken from the Temple Mount, and I took it with a telephoto lens so I could get up close. And this was taken way back in the 1990s. So there are buildings here, but not as many as today. So you can see a path going up here that Jesus would have carried his cross. You can follow it right here, up and around, and to the summit of the Mount of Olives. And this would have been all clear. And then the whole city would be able to see where Jesus was crucified. The historian Josephus does say that the Romans crucified outside the gate of the city on the east. And during the Roman revolt, he mentions 500 people a day being crucified up here. I've done a lot of work on this site. I've surveyed the area. I've walked around. Here's a much earlier photograph that I've shown you before. And there's less buildings, so you can really get an idea of what the slope would have looked like. Just sort of mentally take away all these buildings and walls. Here's the path going up. Here's the path Jesus would have ridden down on, riding the donkey and into the city. And this is the Kidron Valley. This is much steeper than it looks. And whenever I take tour groups, we always walk down, not up, this path going on down. And this is the traditional side of the Garden of Gethsemane. That's probably not the right location, as I've talked about already. So imagine Jesus and the other two victims on the day before Passover being put on the cross on the hill, and it would have been visible to everybody either coming in from the country or even already in the city as the crowds gathered to eat Passover that very evening. It would have been quite a spectacle. This is the path going up, and on both sides of the road, you get bedrock, which is very important. Whenever there's bedrock like this and a road bed, you know that the modern asphalt road that is not ancient is still following the path of the ancient road. These particular roads have been there since the time of King David, if not before. In fact, this road is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible because David walks barefoot up this road weeping when he has to flee the city to get away from his son Absalom, who has revolted against him and is trying to kill him and take over the kingdom. So walking down this road, even though it's a modern road, when you pass this bedrock, you get the feeling of the road bed and how wide it was. It's quite an experience. This would be a more modern view. You can see how the buildings are beginning to just cluster around everywhere. And right here is the summit. That's called the Chapel of the Ascension. Here's the Dome of the Rock. This is looking over the Temple Mount, but it gives you the idea of how this would have looked to everyone in the city as they looked out from their rooftops or from their balconies. We saw some of the views of that last time, looking at the priestly mansions and so forth. And you would see the crucifixions very visibly. The idea of the Romans is to make an example of the victims so that the whole city would hear and fear and tremble. This is what could happen to you if you get out of line. And during the Jewish revolt, as I mentioned, picture 500 crosses all up and down the Mount of Olives. It's just an unbelievable thing to imagine. There is right at the top this bedrock cropping, and from this, you would see everything. Whereas if you go up further, you get back down again. And I've often wondered if this might, in fact, be the very spot where you would put the crosses, because it's right at the center of the Mount of Olives. And also, it's right at the crest as you come up and then start down again. This is hard to find unless you know where it is, but I've wondered if this might be the reference to Golgotha, the place of the skull. We're not sure what skull means. Some have suggested it's the skull of Goliath that King David brought back to Jerusalem and would have buried here on the Mount of Olives. Others have suggested that maybe it looked like a skull, or maybe just a place of execution and death where skulls were left to rot and decay and so forth from crucifixion victims. This is Ballages, the artist that I've used for some of my illustrations. His view of the crucifixion, I've showed you this before. He does have the feet nailed to the side, as you can see. The victims are naked. This would be Jesus in the center. As far as how the hands were attached, we didn't know that at this time when we had this painting commissioned, but you can get an idea. Herod's palace in the far background, Herod's temple that we've surveyed, the fortress Antonio, and the walls going around. I think this is most convincing, and I have very little doubt that Jesus was in fact crucified on the Mount of Olives. And remember, the Constantinian site is 300 years later after the event. And I think the accounts just got garbled. Helena came to Jerusalem. She's asking various people, where was he crucified? Where is he crucified? When Hadrian, the emperor, built the city again into a Roman city, he tore down a monumental tomb of John Hyrcanus right about in the place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. And it might be that stories about that had circulated, that maybe that's the tomb of a messianic figure or a leader or a king or something, and it got garbled. So I find the case very convincing. And when I look at this picture with the women and James, the brother of Jesus, who stays with Mary and the women. All the rest of the disciples have fled away. Okay, where was Jesus crucified and buried? We've done the crucifixion. What about the burial? Here's the key. I've mentioned this before. We can't leave out the Gospel of John when it comes to these historical details. Mark does know things, but he doesn't know the details of John. John is very theological, very embellished. It's much later than Mark. Overall, I would go to Mark first and John second. But if you're dealing with geography, details about place and time and setting, I think John has probably a more historically reliable account. And look what he says, this one section, 2 verses of John 19. Now, there was a garden in the place where he was crucified. And John does also say it was outside the city. I mean, that's very important. But there was a garden. Well, there are plenty of gardens on the Mount of Olives. And in the garden, there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Now, notice, he doesn't say it's Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. People get that confused. Scholars, I hear all the time saying, well, he was put in the tomb of Joseph Arimathea. Only Matthew says that. And Matthew says that because he wants it to be Joseph's tomb so that it can fulfill prophecy of Isaiah 53 that talks about the suffering servant is put in the tomb of a rich man. And he sees, how Matthew's always trying to say, oh, that fulfills scripture, that fulfills scripture. So he knows about him being put in a tomb, but this says no one had ever been laid there. It's a new tomb. It's not even finished yet. But why did they pick that? Everybody forgets the reason. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, not because it's Joseph's tomb, he wouldn't have a tomb right where the people are being crucified. What would be the chances of that? A tomb would be on his property. He's a wealthy man. He owns an estate in Jerusalem in that area. So because of the Jewish day of preparation for the Passover is going to be that evening. As the tomb was close at hand, it tells you the reason. It's an emergency burial. It's a burial of convenience because the feast is coming. They laid Jesus there. That's where they put the body. They put a rock or a block in front of it in order for predators to not be destroying and defiling the body because they've got to wait for Passover and the Sabbath because they're 2 Sabbaths back to back. Friday is a Sabbath and Saturday is a Sabbath. And lo and behold, Saturday night, soon as they could, Joseph of Arimathea and his burial party would have likely gone and retrieved the body and then buried it permanently. It was the tomb that was found empty by Mary Magdalene early Sunday morning. If you look at John 20, the first 10 verses, she goes to the tomb early alone before daylight even because she wants to get there first and other women come later and the body's already gone. And she doesn't conclude that he's raised from the dead. She says, where have they taken him? Meaning they, the burial party, where have they taken him? So the empty tomb is easy to explain. It's sort of obvious if you read this verse, of course it would be empty because you have to move the body and properly rebury it in a permanent way. As far as burial goes, this is a reenactment of a burial shroud based upon some of our archaeological evidence because one burial shroud has been found. It has 2 pieces and a headpiece separate. This is a cutaway of a tomb south of Jerusalem, not on the Mount of Olives, that Shimon Gibson and I came across with our students in the summer of the year 2000, just hiking and looking at some of these ancient tombs, some of which are open and some of which aren't. And this one had been robbed shortly before. This is the entrance up here, and it goes down through several chambers to the lower level. And in this niche right here, blocked up, were the skeletal remains of an individual that had been buried with a shroud. So the shroud was deteriorated, but nonetheless visible, with a headpiece and a body piece. And then these are the ossuaries where the bones were put. This is the only burial shroud ever found in Jerusalem. Normally, you're not going to find cloth in Jerusalem because it's in the mountains, it's high, and it's wet. You get a rainy season, and so fabric is not going to survive. But this person was sealed inside this chamber, and so he survived because water didn't get to it because he had leprosy, Hansen's disease. He also, his hair was fairly intact and fragments of the shroud. And those have all been studied. They've been carbon dated. It is a first century tomb. It's one of the most amazing things that I've ever been involved in, purely by chance, hiking in the Hinnom Valley. And we got there probably the afternoon after the thieves had violated and opened the tomb the night before. But they didn't touch this. They took pieces of ossuaries, probably to take the names. Remember, they scratched names on these ossuaries. Now, there is another tomb that is on the Mount of Olives that I've also been interested in. It has a rolling stone. I've talked about it before. It has Christian graffiti right here, and it does fit the description. It's got some stairs going down. And if you remember the description in the Gospel of John, Peter rushes in and looks, and the place where he was laid is vacant. I don't know if it was this side or this side. And I don't even know if this is the tomb, but it is a tomb on the Mount of Olives, and it does have a rolling stone. Some have said this is a later Byzantine tomb, but I haven't become convinced of that. Anyway, here's another look, just to give you the drama of a empty tomb opening with a rolling stone. Where would the body be taken? Here's the Mount of Olives. Can you make that out? There's the old city right there, Foursquare today. It would have come all the way down to the south right here and gone back up. So if Jesus is crucified here on the Mount of Olives, which would be right in front of the city, right about there, then they come to that tomb, and I think most likely it was carried down into the Kidron in a cross and up to this area, which is a high ridge. From this ridge, you can see all of Jerusalem and you can see Bethlehem. It's a very prominent place, and it's the place of a wealthy estate all the way back to the Iron Age. And we have wondered whether this might have been Joseph of Arimathea's estate. In other words, that he owns this property because he's a rich man. He's living in Jerusalem. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. And maybe if he's burying Jesus on his own property, it could be what we now call the Talpiot tomb or the Talpiot tombs, because there are two tombs. There are actually three. One was destroyed by building crews accidentally, dynamite, but there are two that we can still visit that are intact. Here's what it looks like from the city of Jerusalem. It's right there. You've got these prominent hills, and one derivation of the word Arimathea is the word har, and then the dual, it's called the dual in Hebrew. In other words, two hills, Arimathaim, that they're two hills, Harmathaim. And there are two hills here, and this could be Arimathea. Again, we don't know, but it's a possibility. You see the two radio towers there on the two hills. So the Talpiot tomb is right over the crest of the top here. And you can see it's not very far. They could very easily walk from the Mount of Olives up and then down and up to Talpiot. It's called Talpiot because that's the modern name. Here's what the tomb looked like on the day that it was blasted open. You couldn't see it until the building crews came, and the whole front and porch of the tomb has been blown away, and there was no blocking stone. Surprisingly, there should be a blocking stone, but the tomb was intact. There were 10 ossuaries inside. One of the scholars who has worked on the Talpiot tomb a great deal, he's a geologist, has suggested that the earthquake of 363 CE, that's in the late 4th century, that destroyed so much of Jerusalem, had dislodged huge portions of this mountain, and it had come falling down, and that the blocking stone might have popped out just by the earthquake and just been lost. But anyway, it's an amazing tomb. It's very small. It's smaller than your average bedroom, and it's just over a meter tall, so you have to kind of bend down when you go in it. This facade, this chevron with the little circle in the middle, has interested people because people that think this might be the Jesus tomb try to make some significance of it. But really, we know that that idea of a gabled roof and a wreath in front is used on many, many Roman tombs of the period. It's just a motif to stand for the house of death. It essentially means that the people in this family buried in this tomb are in their house until the resurrection. So they're sleeping in the tomb. This is a very common view of the time. This is an outline view of what the tomb was like in the 10 ossuaries. There were 3 right here. I wish we knew what 3 those were. If we were speculating, I would guess that this might have been Jesus, son of Joseph. This would have been Mariamne, and this would have been Judah, the child of this couple, but we don't know. Now, 6 of these had inscriptions, and we'll talk about that. And even though this drawing shows skulls scattered around, you lay bodies out on these shelves right here. These are shafts where you put the ossuaries. And when the bodies decay after a year or so, you gather the bones. And when this tomb was disturbed at whatever point, a person or maybe the earthquake had brushed all the bones down. So it's not just skulls. As this was excavated, there were bones all under the shelf that had been knocked off. And then this shelf also bones all along here. Here's what it looks like outside. It's sealed up. It's down about 12 feet. And here I am standing in front of it. We did remove this concrete slab back in the year 2005 and were able to explore it and go inside. It's empty. It's been excavated and the ossuaries are in storage at the Israel Museum, as well as the storage unit at Bet Shemesh. Over the years, fairly recently, it was left open and rabbis began to leave holy books inside. This is how you dispose of a book with the name of God. You obviously don't go through it in the garbage can, but it's put to rest in a tomb, just like you would bury a body in a tomb. And so this is not rubbish. These are holy books that were put in, but this is in very recent times. Here's one of those niches, and there are skeletal remains all along here of the last person that was laid out here. And we have the hope of in the future doing DNA studies of some of these bones. And here you can see 2 of the niches. This, by the way, people ask, is that ancient writing? No, that unfortunately is graffiti that kids have probably come in and, written, John was here or something. One of the ossuaries reads Yeshua Bar Yosef. I know it looks like a bunch of scratches, but if you look carefully, it actually is quite an elegant inscription. And also one is Yosei, which is the nickname of the brother of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, translated in English as Yosis. So Yosei, not Yosi. This is rare with the hay. Yosei, not Yosi. Yosi is Yosi. That's very common, even today in Hebrew names. But Yosei is rare. I think only 3 ossuaries have Yosei. So it's interesting that that name would also be included. Here are the ossuaries and what they look like in storage at the Bet Shemesh warehouse. Film crews come and film them. People study them. We've done some preliminary DNA work, but we had to suspend some of our work because of COVID. And now we're just getting back to revisit some of these areas. And now we also have the war in Israel. But there's a lot more to do about this tomb, scientifically speaking. Even though that tomb is empty, so to speak, you can see that it could be studied extensively and should be dug all the way down to bedrock and everything sifted and everything checked and all the bone materials, the fragments of bone materials should be examined for DNA and other kinds of evidence. And we hope that will be done in the future. Here are the 6 names. Yeshua Bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph, Yosei. There is a Maria, and the Maria ossuary matches the Yosei. So these 2 are probably related. What I mean is the style of it is just identical. Same ossuary maker probably made it. We speculated that this would be the mother of Jesus because a widow would be buried with her son. This would be the brother. Mariamne would be probably Mary Magdalene. This particular form of the name, you see it a lot in English, but if you look at the Greek, it's Mariam, not Mariamne. And the A here, and depending on how you read it, can be Mariamne, also known as Mara, or Mary and Mara. Mara can mean Martha, but it can also mean Lordess, meaning Mar, master, Mara, the feminine idea of a lady. So Mariamne, also known as the lady. And then Matya, the word Matthew, we don't know if there's a family member of Jesus' family named Matya. Matthew in the Gospels is not identified as a member of the family. However, there is within the Gospels, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a Levi, son of Alphaeus, one of the 12, also known, we know him as Matthew, but Alphaeus or Clophas is the brother of Joseph, the legal father of Jesus. So it could be that a Matthew ended up in the tomb because of that close family association. Remember, these are extended family tombs. And then there's a child, teenager probably, Yehuda bar Yeshua, Jude, son of Jesus. And this ossuary is very decorated, a lot like the Mariamne ossuary. So I don't want to give a lecture on the Talpiot tombs and all of their contents, and you can find lots of that on my blog as well as my YouTube channel. Just search the word Talpiot, but I'm giving you an overview here. Now, one of the reasons we think it might be the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth is if you took a stadium of, say, 50,000 people and you figured half males, and you ask everybody named Yeshua to stand up, you probably have about 1,000. So fairly common, but not that common. How about a father named Joseph? Goes down to 150. Joseph is a common name, but everybody's father's not Joseph. A mother named Mary? Mary's also a common name, but to have a father and a mother cuts it down to 50. But if you add a brother named James, less than one. Less than one, less than one, meaning sounds like the Jesus family. Now, that's a very oversimplified view of the statistical work that's been done in this tomb, but it gives you kind of a visual to think about. So the question is, was there a brother named James in the Talpiot tomb? Because when it was discovered in 1980, there's not a James ossuary, but then a James ossuary does show up on the antiquities market around that time. And we're not sure exactly when it showed up, but according to the owner of it, you're getting back to that period in general. And here's what it looks like. You might have heard about it. Here's the inscription, and I'll go up close for you. Yaakov is James in Hebrew. Yaakov bar Yosef Achidu Yeshua, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So if this ossuary belonged to James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, and notice the style of it. You can see the style is very similar. It's plain, no decorations, and the name scratched on the side in this case. And the lid is very, very similar as well. So here's the latest on the James ossuary. It's been very much in dispute. Some have argued that brother of Jesus was added to give it value because otherwise you just have James, son of Joseph. Others have argued, no, Jesus was very prominent and it would be proper to put James's name. Remember, he was killed in the year 62 and he was buried in the area of the Kidron Valley, we think. And that's just down below Talpiot. But recently, soil tests, and this is very recent, just even during the COVID period, so it's not known yet much, but soil seeps into this soft limestone. And there were geochemical soil samples done of these ossuaries in the Talpiot tomb, the James ossuary, and then as a control, 8 or 10 other tombs in the Jerusalem area, so that the investigators didn't even know what sample was what. They were taken by the Israel Antiquities Authority. It was very scientifically done, very carefully done. And it turns out that the profile of the soil that is soaked into the James ossuary, even though it looks kind of weathered here and has probably been left outside for some years, it matches very closely the Talpiot tomb. In other words, each tomb has the environment of soil, even though it's in a similar region. So even on the Mount of Olives, if you check two tombs, they're going to have different soil. Now, here's another part of the story that's quite surprising. Less than 200 feet away from the Jesus tomb, the one with Yeshua, son of Joseph, in it, and the other 5 people, and maybe James, You have another tomb on the same estate, the same wealthy estate. And the Jesus tomb was revealed or discovered by building these condos, as you can see all around it, in 1980. And this was the next year, 1981, also in the spring. And this tomb was left intact. They decided to just leave it, not open it. It wasn't really open, it was just exposed. And they sealed it over and left it. And it has the ossuaries inside, and they haven't been removed, which is quite an astounding thing. And here we are with all of our equipment, and we've got Nat Geo camera people and all kinds of things. And we're going to go down into the tomb from the basement of this condo unit with the permission of the owners. What we did is, here's a corridor of the building. This is a storage area in the basement area, the lower level where people store things. And it's a narrow corridor. You see a picture. And we drilled these two holes so that you could get a robotic camera on an arm, and the robotic arm could move around and examine all of these ossuaries that are still inside. It was absolutely one of the most exciting things I've ever done. Here's the permit that we had. You have to have permission to do this. And this is just a survey. We're not going to dig. We're not going to do anything. We had permission also of the Orthodox Jews to do this. They were there supervising it. Here's our team. This is the filmmaker, Simcha Jacobovici. This is Rami Arav, a professor at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. There you probably recognize me. And the team of investigators all together posing for a picture. And here's what we did. There's a robotic arm that was designed. And then here's where we're drilling the hole, all kinds of equipment to see what we were doing. And now here we are watching the monitors. So it was so surrealistic. It reminded you really of like a moon landing or something, even though it's under the floor of the building you're in, to be watching this remotely. And here's the view we first got. Can you imagine the excitement? Because some archaeologists had gone in 1980 and kind of surveyed what was there, but then they left the remains intact, except for one ossuary that they did remove. But the rest were left there. So could this tomb have belonged to Joseph of Arimathea? Maybe it's his family tomb. This is a pillar that supports the condo, nothing to do with the ancient tomb. Here's the camera coming down. So we're up here in the basement area, and then we're watching on a monitor. And here's our camera. This is one of the niches. If you go back and look at your map, you can see that is this niche right here. This was the one we first saw. Then we examined these, then we examined these. This one is of great interest because this one, number 3, has an image on it, but you can only see part of it. And it looks like an image of Jonah being spit out of a great fish. And it has the name Jonah written across the fish's mouth. And this one has a 4-line Greek inscription that we think has to do with resurrection of the dead, celebrating the idea of being raised up from Sheol, which is a symbol of death. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. So here are those two ossuaries. There's where the Jonah image is. This here you can't see anything, but we're able to angle it around and get down in, but we can't see what's on this side of the ossuary. There you can see, we see the fish, you see the flippers here and the tail is irregular, and then representing the scales, and then the mouth. At first we thought this was maybe a stick figure, and then we figured out these are letters. This is Yod, Vav, Nun, Hey, but it's written around. I'll show you in a minute as I trace it. And then you've got 2 lines. You got the mouth line and the gill line. So let me show you a better image of that, and you can see very clearly. So this is, if you know Hebrew, Yonah, Yonah, written in beautiful Herodian script. And then the marks right here. There's the gill mark and the mouth mark, and he's spitting something out. Now, this is the earliest image of Jonah ever found. Jonah was not an image of resurrection in any Jewish literature that we know. You would think it would be, but it pops up in the New Testament as Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah, and Jonah being in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, and the Son of Man being in the belly of the earth or death. And when you read the book of Jonah, I'm going to show you the passage in a minute, it does sound like he's actually in the fish, which is in a way like being in a tomb. And so the parallel is very interesting. And what would this be then? Well, the text says he rolled out wrapped in seaweed. So a ball of seaweed, maybe. So there are no images of Jonah to go by. Jewish art does not have images of Jonah. I think this is the earliest one ever found. But Christian art is full of images of Jonah where a fish is spitting out a human figure. So this might be the very first, because why would you have a Jonah image in a Jewish tomb less than 200 feet from a Jesus tomb? Maybe because people have a new resurrection belief because they think Jesus has been raised from the dead. Now, here's the passage in Jonah. The waters closed over me to take my life. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the land whose bars closed forever. He's in the fish, but it's pictured as Sheol, as the pit. And then, oh, Yahweh, my God, raise me up, and so forth. So there's a composite view of what the fish looks like, and you can see all the lines accounted for, and it's quite amazing. And next to it, on that other ossuary, is a 4-line inscription. It says Dios in Greek, God, and it is a Greek inscription, and then Iao, Yahweh, O God, Yahweh, Upso, raise up, Hagba, raise up. So Greek, Hebrew, but in Greek, Yahweh, and then Greek, raise up, and then Hagba in Hebrew. So, O God, eternal God, raise up, lift up, lift up. And we think it's a prayer for resurrection, or it could even be a prayer celebrating resurrection. So I think that Jonah image next to the Jesus tomb, and then you put in also all the other things that I've mentioned. I think it's a good chance, especially with the James ossuary, that the Talpiot tomb is in fact where Jesus was permanently moved. So the final question is, well, then why would people believe in resurrection? If he's in a tomb somewhere, did they not know it? I think they knew it. I think they're not thinking of resurrection as the resuscitation of a corpse. I know later that's the idea because the Gospels are written in an apologetic or defensive way to say, no, no, it wasn't a ghost, it was a real body. But when Paul talks about resurrection, and Paul's the earliest witness, he's from the 50s, he says he's seen the Lord right here. I've seen the Lord. He appeared to me in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, I've seen Jesus. But when you ask him what he saw a glorified spiritual body of Jesus. And he tells the believers in Jesus, you're going to be raised up from your tombs and transformed into a glorious spirit being like Jesus was. So what's left behind? The remains of the body, but it's like old clothing, taking off old clothing, being reclothed. Your soul is reclothed with the new body. The body's like clothing. So it's interesting when you talk about the sightings of Jesus, the appearances, as they're sometimes called. First of all, Mark doesn't have any, but he says you're going to see him in Galilee, but we don't have an account of it. But Matthew has Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and she sees Jesus, and then Galilee on a mountain, but it says some doubted. Luke has only Jerusalem appearances, and John has Jerusalem and the Galilee. I think these are all secondary. These are developed later, after 70 AD. I think in the time before the destruction of Jerusalem, you could visit the tomb of Jesus. You could go there. It can be a place of devotion. Rabbis are buried all over the land of Israel from antiquity into modern times, and visiting the tomb is not the point because the bones and the decaying flesh is not the person. That's what's left behind. Resurrection is transformation. Paul calls it metamorphosis, to be transformed. And he talks about leaving the old clothes behind and receiving new clothes as a naked soul. This is in 2 Corinthians 5. So the earliest source of resurrection is 1 Corinthians 15. And what Paul says he got from the Jerusalem church is that Jesus first appeared to Peter, or he was sighted by Peter, and the 12, and a group of 500. So these are what we call apparitions. Doesn't mean they're untrue. It just means it's not a corpse walking around resuscitated. That's not the idea of resurrection to these people. And then he appeared to James, his brother, and then all the rest of the apostles. And then he says, last of all to me. And when you ask him, well, what did you see? He says, well, I can't describe the body. It's glorious. It's immortal. It's powerful. It's not flesh and blood. He says it's not flesh and blood. And so far from a ghost, it's a spirit being. Paul calls the resurrected Jesus a life-giving spirit, but he has a body, and he says it's a spiritual body, a wind body, but not a body of flesh. I'm going to stop the share. And that ends our series as far as the archaeology on the Jesus archaeology. Now, I also want to share one other thing about the place of crucifixion and a little more on Talpiot. So this is my blog, jamestabor.com. Be sure and sign up for the newsletter here. And you can check out the Patreon if you want. And also there is a notification if you want to know when there's something coming out, because I put things up several times a week. But if you type in the search feature right here, let's try it, Golgotha. See if I can spell it, Golgotha, the place of crucifixion. Okay. You'll come to this post, locating Golgotha, and I'll click on it. And here I put my full case for the Mount of Olives being the place of crucifixion. So you can see there's going to be a lot more here, all kinds of evidence taking you through. So you can go read that and study it. Here I go through Gordon's Calvary and all the other places, and I go on down, and you can see I give a lot of evidence. Now you can also type in, let's go back to the top, Talpiot. It's the easiest way to get this Jesus tomb stuff. And there is a lot. Look, 78 results. And you can just start digging in. A couple of the posts are summary posts, and they have in-depth reading. For example, this one, because when you click on it, you get all of these links to other materials. Look at all of that. You can study forever. And this book, got a copy right here that I wrote with Simca Jacobovici, and it gives all the evidence, and the notes are very dense and they're very academic, and all the documentation. So if you want to read all about Talpiot, you need to check that out. So check the blog for any subject, explore the blog. There's a lot to it, publications, papers, the Jewish Roman World of Jesus, YouTube, books that I recommend, and so forth, online courses. It's the one-stop shop for Tabor stuff if you're interested. So I want to do one more. What I want to do is I want to take this book that I'm reviewing, written by James Strange, the son of the famous Jim Strange, Excavating the Land of Jesus, How Archaeologists Study the People of the Gospels. And I want to do a lecture or a presentation as the final one of this series, number 15, next time, on methodological ways of going about examining evidence. In other words, how do you take texts? How do you decide which text to take? How do you judge the archaeological evidence? I'm not sure there's anything we can say about the historical Jesus based on texts and archaeology that everybody would agree on, especially since some people don't think Jesus even existed. So, you've got that. But there is a method to the madness, as I say. It's not cherry picking. It's not arbitrary. There's actually a way of going about judging evidence, and I want to try to lay that out for you next time. So take care, everybody, and I hope you're enjoying this series. If you haven't heard the earlier episodes, scroll on through them. If you go to jamestabor.com and just type in Slash Smart Jesus Archaeology, you'll get the whole playlist. It's an easy way to do it. I'll put it in the description. I'll put some of these other things in the description too, so you don't have to go hunting for them. See you later.